All right, hopefully you're in the right place. This is website failover and disaster recovery strategies to help you sleep better, hopefully. I'm Kristen, and I know almost everybody here, but I am a co-founder at Quant. And Quant is a CDN. We also have a web application firewall. We have static hosting, static failover, a lot of fun stuff. It's been great working over there. And some disclaimers. This isn't a plug for Quant, but there is some Quant services that we provide that are kind of touched upon throughout the presentation. But to keep everything fair, I'm also including competitors and other options. So just want to make that clear. The other thing is I have not tried everything that I'll have logo walls. I haven't tried all the things, right? So this is just to give you an idea of what's out there. Okay, so the idea is you have websites you're in charge of. You're going to try to get yourself organized and do all the right things so that hopefully you are sleeping at night. We're going to talk about what types of things can happen, some planning exercises, some best practices that you're probably doing some of them, but maybe there's more that you need to add, monitoring and testing options, and then kind of ways that you can fail over or recover a little more quickly when things do go wrong. But let's start with a story, because probably all of us have some disaster stories, and I will keep names out of this. And I worked on a really large website, big team, large website, complex, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of moving parts, and we were working on a lot of new features and functionality. And it was actually it wasn't the type of website where you like continuously, deploy stuff like every week or anything. It was more like we did a big chunk of work over a couple, 2-3 months, and then, did big QA with the client and then would push it out. Well, so we're, working on this, and we're probably maybe 80% done through the QA, and they had their own QA, and, it was a whole process. And, we had done our side of things, do the peer reviews and our own dev testing and all that stuff. So meanwhile, we had someone that was going to take that code and do some performance load testing on a kind of identical but parallel environment. It was supposed to be like apples to apples. We were trying to have it mirror, the production environment. So it was actually an entirely different account and set up, more or less the same way. Well, someone accidentally pushed all that code that was not fully QA'd to production rather than the test environment. And that was one of the scariest moments of my life in a work situation. Maybe I don't know. I was like literally shaking, hyperventilating. I was just like freaking out. It was not a good thing. So fortunately, I had a friend who was like trying to calm me down and like, okay, you got to breathe. You got, you'll get through this. You'll get through this. Rolling back was not an option. This was a live site with a lot of activity, all that. So backups and all that was not gonna cut it. So fortunately, we had gotten through enough QA that there wasn't any big major hiccups, but just scrambling, testing, like in any and all remaining things, and trying to make sure there was nothing major that was gonna, cause problems. So, there was a couple days of, very frantic just QA and telling the client that was fun. But lesson learned, make sure only the people who need access to things have access to things. And at the time, this person had access, and they didn't really need access because they weren't really doing that whole production process. So feel free to share additional stories later if we have time in the Q&A, or over a beer if you're going to be at Tressiter. Okay, so there's so many things that can happen. So your website blows up, something bad happens. What's going on? Some you know, a lot of websites have something similar to this. They might not have all of these layers, but you know, they might have a CDN, a WAF, web application firewall, web server, you know, all the things. And any one of these things can go wrong, right? Any one of these things. You have caching issues, you have weird WAF rules where you're blocking people you shouldn't be blocking. You know, all of these things can go wrong. Even the end user, right? You get end users who are like, this is broken, and it's not really broken. It's just them, and so you have to work through that as well. So all of these things have the potential of failing. And there's many aspects, right? So it might be the software or the hardware. It could be a natural disaster. It could be a tech thing or, you know, a human thing, like my example. Maybe it's widespread, it's worldwide, or it's just in one location. I've had another example where like San Jose was affected and, you know, but most other places weren't. Could be hackers, could be just an accident, so forth and so on, right? So there's just a lot of different things that can happen. So I'm going to give some theoretical examples. A content editor's cat deletes the English homepage of a website. The other website homepages work in the other languages. There is no database backup. All right, so in this situation, it is, you know, definitely something time sensitive, needs to be fixed because anyone going to that English homepage, they're going to have a problem, get a 404. Fortunately, the other languages are still working. Since there's no backup, that's a little bit tricky. Like, how do you recover from this? Well, maybe you have a staging server where you happen to have a copy that's pretty fresh that you can kind of copy paste over from there. Or maybe one of the developers happens to have pulled down the database recently and you could get it from them. Or it's been, you know, there's a cache, you know, on the internet or the you know, Wayback Machine or something that you grab from. Or worst case in this, you know, maybe they're going to have to reverse engineer it. And, you know, if those are translated pages, they could just sort of translate back into English. Another example, disgruntled IT employee takes a sledgehammer to a database server. There's no failover or redundancy. There is a remote database backup. Okay, in this situation, you've lost your database server. There's no failover, but you were smart and you have this remote backup. So that's awesome. So now what you need to do here is get a new server up and running, and then you're going to have to, you know, load that backup in there. So it's a temporary situation, but you can move forward. Another situation, a website is under a DDoS attack by a bored 12-year-old middle school student, and there have been major DDoS attacks by very young people. So this is not that out there. There's no CDN, there's no WAF, and you looked at the, you know, you somehow able to get into the logs and you see that, yeah, it's just like all these IP addresses and you're not sure what to do. In this situation, you know, maybe you could scramble and get a, you know, insert a WAF in there real quick, still take a little bit of time. It'd be hard to like block all those IP addresses because there's a lot, and usually, you know, it kind of could be more and more. So since this is a bored 12-year-old, maybe they'll move on to something else and you'll just have to wait a little bit. So there's so many things, right? Maybe you did a bad deployment. Maybe you got on the front page of the New York Times, and you know your resources are being overloaded. They can't handle that kind of traffic. Maybe you were hacked. There's just, you know, basically so many things that there's an infinite number, really, right? Once you take all the different permutations of things, there's just so many things that could go wrong. So the idea is to try to be ready for anything, but you can't, I mean, anything in air quotes, because there's so many things you can't really be ready for all that, right? So you're just going to try to do the best you can, get as prepared as possible, and, you know, so that you have the tools ready for when things happen. Hopefully you are not at a blank slate at the moment. Hopefully you have some things that you're already doing that we talk about here, and hopefully you at least have backups or, you know, certain things. But we'll just kind of run through everything. And this is something that is useful to do as part of this whole process is build a disaster recovery plan where you're documenting all of the procedures and processes so that you can quickly recover when a disaster happens. And the general kind of parts of this is you're going to inventory everything, anything that's part of your system. The analytics, third-party analytics, how do you get into the hosting environment? If you're using a CDN, how do you get there? Who's doing what? Who has access? So all your contacts, your status pages, you want to inventory all the things and just make sure it's very, very clear, all the different pieces of the puzzle, because when you're debugging, you need to go and look at all these things. And you're going to want to assess your risks. So if you have a site that's not really that important, then, if it's down a day or two, it's fine. And then you might have other sites where you're like, no, it's not acceptable. We need it back up as soon as possible. I work with a lot of government websites, and that's the case there. Usually these sites, they need to have the content up there, in order to, serve their citizens, right? So you want to understand your risks and how far you need to go in order to put, mitigation in place. And then document all of the things. And the thing about the documentation, it's better to be overly pedantic about your steps, right? So just like go here, log in, this account or whatever, check here, like be really, really specific and just spell it out, because what happens in an emergency, your gut is just like, I'm freaking out, I don't know what to do. But if you have that, you can just go there and go, it's okay, I have it all spelled out. I'm just going to go through each process. And a side note on that, you should also make sure your hotfix, if you do have to do a hotfix as part of your deployment process, that's really well documented as well, because you may have to do that in sort of an emergency situation, and you want to just go step by step and be able to breathe and go through each thing. You'll have your recovery team. Might be a team of one or many, and you're going to need to define those roles and responsibilities. And then make sure everyone is trained on all the things as much as possible within their skill set, and run through some exercises. Now be careful that those exercises don't accidentally run on live, that they're actually running in a test environment or whatever. But you should try recovering from a backup, see if that works and that all the steps are documented properly. And if you have a disaster of some sort, you need to have a retrospective, figure out, okay, what went wrong here? Can we build in something into our process? Can we mitigate that somehow in order to prevent it in the future? And so in my example before, we said, okay, it's not going to 100% eliminate the problem, but let's narrow down the scope of who has access to that production environment and make sure that they're only doing it when they really need to. So there's various topics, and there I do have a resources section at the end. It links off to some recovery plan articles. But like we talked about, risk management, roles and responsibilities, the contact information is super important. Like, need to know, like, who am I contacting for all of these different systems? What backup strategy? Where are your backups? How often are they backed up? How do you access those? And all of your step-by-step procedures. And another thing is a communication plan. And with that communication plan, you want to be able to communicate internally to your internal team who's debugging stuff, whether it's Slack or whatever. You also want to be able to communicate to the stakeholders, the site owners, the client, whoever it is that's sort of interested in making sure that this site is up and running. And you want to make sure you have a way if possible, of communicating with the users of the site. And now if the site's down, it's a little bit tricky. If it's going to be an extended outage, maybe there's some way, maybe you have, the email addresses and you're able to send out some, something to them, or at least maybe there's a status page that's separate from your site where it has the status of what's going on. And again, running through sort of testing exercises. So here are just some common processes of things that probably people have done before. User reports an issue, you confirm it. Yep, sure enough, it is an issue. You review all the status pages of all the things. Okay, doesn't seem to be that. Doesn't mean it's not that. So that's another thing, keep in mind. Just because your hosting says that there isn't a problem, doesn't mean there isn't a problem with them. So you may end up not finding anything internally and opening that ticket later. But in this case, we review our internal logs. We see, oh, there's some error with some query. We need to go and fix it. We go do our code change and have a hot fix. Usually a hot fix, if you're doing like dev test live sort of workflow, you have a way of kind of going around that process and not, in case there's stuff that's like mid-dev that's not ready to go out. Another example, they report an issue. Yep, it's an issue. You review the status page. Okay, the hosting company is having an issue. Okay, no problem. Well, you just get to wait, right? There's not really much you can do other than click refresh, 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 and they fix it and all good. And the last one we kind of touched upon before, user reports a problem. You're going back and forth with them, back and forth. You're like, it's not us, right? This is on your end. So that's also another common one. But there's so many different parts of the workflow, but your team needs to be comfortable navigating these different processes. And sometimes you are a team of one. Just because you're a team of one doesn't mean you shouldn't still do as much as you can to prepare, because you're just helping yourself, right? When you document all these things, if you're not the site owner, you're going to want to share it with the site owners and make sure that they have access in case something happens to you. You're on vacation, they have to pull in someone, a backup, last minute to try to fix something. Just make sure that, it's all well understood and doing those testing of the backups. Something that I've noticed a lot with when it's just a kind of a one-person dev team is they'll often use our personal email for different systems because they're like, I'm going to set up, this third-party whatever form thing that we're going to use, and they'll use their personal one. So don't do that. Make sure it's something that the site owners basically have control over, that you get access in the proper way, because that can be an issue, especially in a disaster situation. And keep your cat off your laptop. Of course, the cat owners are like, yeah, that's not going to happen. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some best practices. And again, you're probably doing some of these things, hopefully a lot of these things, but, and there's a lot, won't cover every single thing on here, and there's more that aren't even listed, but so there's a lot of stuff. And if at all possible, just don't be cheap, right? Having a solid website that's less likely to go down means you need to spend some money, right? The idea is you spend the money up front so that you don't have to spend more trying to recover it later, right? What's that phrase? A ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or I might have gotten that wrong way around, but you know what I mean. It can often be more expensive to recover than it is to just do, all the right things from the start. And I had sites that got hacked before where they came to us. They weren't our sites, but they were on Drupal, I think, some old version of Drupal. They got hacked and they came and they're like, help us. It was not cheap to get them back to a usable site, right? If they would have just done a few things, just done their security patches, for example, or kept their stuff up to date, they probably would have been fine. So again, good planning, good people, good technology providers, and coffee or tea or kombucha or whatever your drink of choice is. But you really want to be thinking like, okay, I want something that's solid, that knows, people that know what's going on, and that's super important. But there are projects where they don't have a lot of money, of course. So for those, you just access, you want to make sure that the right people have access, but just enough access to do what they need to do. So don't, give them the keys to everything if it doesn't make sense. So you need to, because, they may press something wrong, like the other example. So that's a key thing. Backups in multiple places, and we'll talk about that more. And then leverage free tools. Plenty of free monitoring tools, analysis tools, load testing tool, all sorts of free stuff that you can use. So even if your budget is small, doesn't mean you can't be doing a lot of these things. And then keep your pig off your laptop. All right, so a example, good tech stack. This is pretty similar to the last slide with the infrastructure stack, but managed hosting is added here, and offsite backups. So managed hosting is going to, ideally you're using some sort of managed hosting so you don't have to worry about the web server. They're using redundancy, they're using caching, they're doing all the good things. You don't have to worry about your database server, all that stuff, right? And they have automated backups and it's all good. And so managed hosting can be a really great way of mitigating risk. Doesn't mean they're not going to go down. Sometimes they will, but at least that is a good piece of the puzzle. And then having a web application firewall to keep out all those bad actors, and a CDN, so content delivery network, that's helping you, spread your documents and your images around the world so that it, reduces the load on your website. And so with the managed hosting, usually, they're going to have backups, but treat those as on-site backups, even if they're using some third-party service and they're like, oh yeah, it's all good. It's an external thing. Just treat those as on-site backups, because if they're having problems, just assume that their backups are going to have problems, and you're going to want to have off-site backups as well. So again, I have not used all these things. Well, maybe on the right side I have, but lots of different managed hosting, and it depends on the stack you're using, right? If you're on Drupal, there's some familiar names here, Acquia, Pantheon Platform. I've used all those and others. I'm not so much on the WordPress side, but there's some WordPress ones as well. But maybe you're not even on WordPress or Drupal, you're on something else, but you're going to want to try to find some sort of managed hosting to make your life easier. And then for offsite backups, again, it kind of depends on the stack you're using. Basically, you're just going to have some files, right? You have a database dump, you'll have the physical files, the images, the documents, that kind of thing. And with the code, you should be using a code repository. You could even include the code, if you wanted, with that bundle. But the thing is, like for an example with Drupal, if you were using backup and migrate, you could add on a module like that for S3, which would take those backups and it would copy it over to S3, so you have a safe place for those. You could even be crazy and do multiple ones if you wanted. And then for CDN and WAF, number of providers, Quant does that along with all these others and more, did not include everybody. Just a side note that Quant does use Fastly they partner with Fastly for their backbone. So a little bit of redundancy there. And then there's more things, and I'm not going to go over all this, right? There's just so many things that can happen. You want to learn from things that go wrong, try to incorporate that back into your process. You want to set up good alerts so you know proactively, yes, something is actively happening right now. Review your logs regularly, proactively fix those things. You're going to see errors in your logs. That's just the way it happens, right? And make sure that those things are getting fixed on a regular basis, right? So those are just, there's so many things. There's more than this, right? And we'll make these slides available, but so there's a lot of, this is all like proactive stuff that you can do to try to minimize your downtime and just be prepared. And some other things you can do are use monitoring and testing tools just to make sure that your website is, being watched. So some of those things, I'll go into some of the different ones you can use, but for like uptime monitoring and performance monitoring, there are different really cool tools that you can use. Uptime monitoring is basically your website's there and there's a tool, external tool that goes and hits some pages on your site and tries to see, okay, are they up? Are they slow? And then you can just set up alerts and let you know if something's going on. The performance monitoring, so there's APM, which is application performance monitoring, and that is a much more deep dive into your application. So it really depends on what you're using for your website. But for example, for Drupal, you can see database queries, you can say code things happening, all sorts of, it's very, very useful to like when you're having, you want to get a better idea of how your application is, your website is performing. And, and then there's load testing. So load testing is like when you hammer a website, try to see how it performs under a load to, try to be like, oh, I'm on Reddit and now I'm getting all this traffic, or I'm on the New York Times, how that happens. And there's free tools for that. And one thing is the user feedback. Make sure that there's an easy way for people to let you know there's something going on, just because you've got monitors in place, you're doing all the testing, you're doing your QA, you've got all, you're checking your logs, you're doing all these things, does not mean that you're going to see all the things, right? So you should also have an easy way for your users to give you feedback on stuff that's going on. So some tools, again, haven't used all these, vulnerability scanning, some software you can use, third-party software for those, and for load testing. I'm not sure if there's any free vulnerability scanning software, or at least external services, but certainly for load testing, there are some that you might be able to use if you're on a budget. And then for uptime monitoring, I've mostly used Pingdom, which is a great tool, but there's a lot of them. And again, that's just like you say, oh, hit these important pages and it's going to, let you know if something's going on. And the application performance monitoring, I've mostly used New Relic. It's an amazing tool. And some of the managed hosting will actually give you New Relic for free. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at managed hosting. Do they provide some of these cool tools for you so that you can leverage those? And if they do, make sure to use them. So now talk a little bit more about sort of reducing that time. Something happens and how can you kind of reduce the recovery time? So you want to just help people work as fast as possible in that sort of stressful situation. And we talked a little bit about having those really pedantic step-by-step instructions, like overly explain all the things, have links out to things, like make it, super, super clear. And then you need redundancy in your team, not just in your systems. So you have to make sure, unless you're a team of one, then you're just going to have to go with having it all documented. But any kind of cross training you can do to make sure you have a backup. You want to be able to go on vacation. You want to be able to go to Tahiti for 2 weeks and unplug and not, not worry about getting a call like, oh, there's a disaster. There's many, so DrupalCon's next week. There's many a DrupalCon where someone was like, my site is melted. You have to go and fix this right now. And I'm like, no, I don't want to. I want to enjoy the hallway track and have fun. So any kind of cross training you can do. And on that note, something that I noted earlier is having like an emergency calendar. Like if you are going to be going on vacation and there's other people who are your backup, make sure that the client or the stakeholders know that's the person to contact during whatever Christmas or whatever it might be. I'm going to be out, so that's also super helpful. And the last thing here is, right, if you do need to open support tickets for your hosting, your CDN, or any of these services, be very, very verbose about all the things you tried. And, I tried this web page and this web page. I went to, I had my friend over in the Philippines try it. It wasn't working for them. I looked at our logs. I didn't see anything that, da 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 da. There was this one hosting service. I won't name, but any Drupal person would know who I'm talking about, where there would be issues. There would be nothing on the status page, but I knew it was them. I just knew. I knew it was them. And so I would go in, they had New Relic. And so I'd go in and I would see, okay, there's something funky going on there. And I could narrow it down to it's something on their end of things. So I'd literally link out to those New Relic reports and say, here, there's something going on over there. go fix it, please. And yep, sure enough, happened a few times where, I was just like giving them as much information to fix it as fast as possible. So you're not doing all this back and forth. And then, ideally you're using managed hosting, so you're not even gonna have to worry about all the stuff here on this slide, but because they're hopefully having, load balancers, and maybe they don't have database failover, but these are some of the things that you should consider when you are looking for vendors who are going to do managed hosting or whatever part of your tech stack, that they have these failovers in place. So a load balancer is just, traffic comes in and it's going to redirect to multiple, 2 or more web servers and distribute that load. Another side benefit of that is if one of those web servers fails, you have the others that can just continue to work, right? So that's the failover part. As far as geographical redundancy, if you use a CDN, that's one way of spreading at least your static assets around the world and having that kind of redundancy. So like if someone in the Philippines, maybe normally their closest CDN location is maybe, I don't know, Japan or something, but that for some reason that one's down, then maybe it's going to be coming from London because that's the next closest one, right? So having that kind of redundancy. And there's actually sometimes for big projects, they'll have whole data centers, like actually AWS projects can be more like this, where they're like, okay, we're going to actually replicate things across physical data centers. So they might have one in the United States and one in Europe and so forth. That way, if something really major like a natural disaster happens, it takes it all down, then boom, they've got this other one that they can use. And then primary, secondary database, you may have heard of this. It just, you have your main database, that's the one you're using, but all of the data is getting synced to a secondary database. And that way, if the primary has a problem, it just can fail over to the secondary one. But there's lots of infrastructure components that can have failover built in, DNS, networking components, there's just caching, all of these different pieces of the puzzles can often have a failover component. Now, are you going to be implementing all this stuff? Probably not, but it's something to keep in mind when you are looking at vendors. And so another aspect is we, talked about backups being super important, and this idea of having not just internal backups, but having this external remote backup as well. So that's obviously, minimum, you need to do that. But content revisions enabled on content is kind of like having, it's kind of like backup for content. That can save you unless we have the cat situation where all of the content was deleted, but at least, if they did something really, they were in there and they took out a bunch of paragraph content, components, and they're like, it'd be too hard to rebuild these. I don't know exactly what I did. Then they can go back and revert to that. And another thing is if you have a staging environment, which hopefully you do, or other environments, a QA environment, cloning to those regularly, at least then you have a reference site. If something is weird going on, or you need to compare something, or maybe you need to do a quick copy paste because something went wonky and for some reason your revisions aren't set up or whatever, then you kind of have something in your back pocket. And the last thing I'll cover here is the idea of a static site for failover. And this is something, you could try to set up yourself, where you have a static site that's just sort of a snapshot of your site. And then, you cut over to that if there's a lot of problems on your website and you're going to need some time in order to fix those. But yeah, so just a FYI, Quant does provide static failover. There may be other companies that do as well, but and it is something you could potentially set up on your own, but then you're going to have to do that cut over to manually. So there's different ideas about failover. Like sometimes failover means it's automatically just like kicks in, right? That primary database fails and it just knows, oh, it's failing, it switches right over. So it's sort of like automatic failure. And then there's other failover where it takes a manual intervention, right? You have the other thing there ready to go, but you might need to click a few buttons, right? So it's not like you have to have everything automated, but you just want to try to make things as fast as possible. So for the idea of static failover is you have a website and you're constantly changing it, and you're getting a static copy as you make changes, ideally as you make changes. You can have different ones where they, maybe they, are only updated once a week or once a day or whatever, if for some reason that works better for your organization. But you can set them up where you are, pretty up to date with the content as you push stuff out. Now, the side note on a static site, obviously, is if you have any very dynamic components on the site, it's not really going to, not just like JavaScript that's doing something in the page, but actually it's communicating back to the database server or something like that. Those aren't going to work on the static site. The static site is just static, right? There's no database, it's self-contained. You can take those files, throw them on some hosting server and bring them up, and you'll see a static representation of your website. But for a lot of sites, that's actually good enough, at least in an emergency situation where they can still get at content. So like I mentioned, work a lot with government sites, and they need the content up there. And if there's a glitch on the back end, they still want the most of the site to be working and functional, because it's mostly informational, and they'll have some forms and things. But so having a static site to just kick over to when something happens can be really useful. And either you can do that manually, set it up so that you're doing your static site, generated it, regularly, and then kick it over yourself, or use a service where, you basically just say failover, you tick a box, says failover on, to the static site, if there's a problem. Now, let me just do a time check. Okay, I'm just going to run through these really fast. There are some real life examples. I gave you some fake examples, but there's some real life examples that are kind of interesting. NASDAQ, which is the US stock exchange back in the day, this is a long time ago. I was still in high school. All right, so a squirrel, yes, a squirrel, caused a power failure. So everything shut down and prevented millions of shares from being traded. Squirrel number 2 strikes in 1994. I thought that was kind of funny. Probably not the same squirrel. So that was kind of a fun one. Some ship off of Egypt put their anchor down, boom, power cable got wiped out. Millions and millions of people affected, and across several countries. So that's another example. Then this one. So if you didn't know, which I guess I had heard of this before, I didn't really sink in until I was writing this, but Greenwich Mean Time, which is like the official time, right? They have to tweak it every so often. So they have something called a leap second that happens every few years in order to keep time in sync with the planet's rotation. And in 2012, not all sites and not all companies, but a good number of large sites choked on this. Even though they knew it was coming, they give you 6 months in advance to know that there's going to be a leap second change, but they didn't handle it. So they had to do some software changes to recover from that. Yes. So DDoS attacks are distributed denial of service attacks, where a hacker decides to, hijack a bunch of computers, usually in order to, bring down websites. In this case, many IoT devices, so IoT, Internet of Things, like a baby monitor that is, connected to the internet, or I mean Siri, or there's all these things around us right now that are connected to the internet. So it hijacked all of these devices and shut down a lot of sites for days. Actually, it took a long time for them to recover from that. And then there was like litigation and stuff that went into 2017. So that, yeah, pretty crazy. And the last real example I'll give you is a typo. And haven't we all done that? So this poor S3 developer, I'm sure they probably still think about it. They just, typed something wrong and took out a bunch of servers they didn't mean to. And a ton of sites went down. It was a big deal. And then they had to do a full restart. So like, just reboot it, I wasn't sure if that was like rebooting all of S3 or all of AWS, but it was a big deal. So yeah, I would not want to be that person. So on that note, I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but I will stop there, and I will turn the floor. If anyone wants to come off mic, feel free. I don't know if there were any questions in the chat along the way.
No questions in the chat.
There are. Okay, cool. Let me find the chat. Where's my chat? There's my
I was
chat.
saying there were no questions.
Oh, there were no. Gotcha. Well, everybody knows all this stuff, right? Or it was just so clear.
It was so clear.
Or feel free to share if anonymized website disaster story. Those are fun. I'm sure Andrew has some, and probably Amy June too. Maybe others. Don't be shy.
All right, if you prompt me.
Yeah, go for it.
So some services will allow you to restore from backups, okay? And this can be a very dangerous thing, especially if you try it on a live site. Because, while you're restoring your site, people are visiting your site. And your site's coming back up, your database is coming back up, the site starts to try to write to the database. And you can really, really mess up, So, that happened to us. The button looks compelling and tempting. And I think what we ended up doing was just flipping the DNS over to the test site, even though it was not set up for the same type of load and quite slow. It was at least feature complete. And then we could restore to the live environment from the backup while it took its sweet old time, and then flip the DNS back. But definitely in all a DNS service like Cloudflare or something that has really instant propagation, because you don't want to be like pulling your hair out while that DNS is propagating.
Yeah, that's a great example. And especially if your users are interacting in a site in a less superficial way, they're actually like logged in and they're saving data and all that. all of a sudden, yeah, you don't want like that restore from backup just to be right then and there. You need to boot everybody off first before you do anything. So yeah, that's a great example. All right, I know we're just over time, but anybody else want to share? Oh, Irina's there. Maybe Irina has a website disaster story, or anyone else, or questions. Crystal clear. Everyone's like, I want beer. All right. Well, thank you. And we'll call it good. And I'll see some of you in a couple hours.
Thanks, KP.